As we look forward to tomorrow's holiday, it's a good time for us to look back at the beginning of Thanksgiving. What brought the Pilgrims to America? What was the first Thanksgiving like? And interestingly, given all the attention that socialism has been getting recently, what happened when the Pilgrims experimented with socialism? And what lessons can Americans learn today from the Pilgrims? Well, here to walk us through the history of the American Thanksgiving holiday is Dr. Paul Jehle, the Executive Director of the Plymouth Rock Foundation. Dr. Jehle, welcome back to Washington Watch. It's great to have you.
Good to be with you here on this on the eve of this Thanksgiving.
On the eve of this wonderful, wonderful holiday, and I'm so glad to have you with us to talk through some of this. So let's start through some basic questions, like what led the Pilgrims to leave their homes and set out for America in the first place? What was life like for them when they were in England, and what made it appealing for them to come to America?
Well, when William Bradford wrote his history of the Pilgrim story, and he started that history about 10 years after they landed, he let them know that one of the first things that happened, we have to realize that around 1550, 1560, a revival had been breaking out in England, and it was dubbed the Revival of Hearth and Home. That meant that many families were beginning to walk with God. They were getting converted, and preachers were going home to home in every hamlet around England. And this is where, for instance, many of the Pilgrim fathers, they would be known to be called, were around their hearth and reading from the Bible with their parents. And it was a grassroots kind of revival. And of course, this is where the Pilgrims began. And they made it very clear that as soon as they began to get their ignorance and sins discovered unto them by the Spirit of God and get converted, the civil society around them began to persecute them. And keep in mind that we had King James, who was a very well-taught theologian, but pagan at heart, loved his royalty. He believed in the divine right of kings, and because of that, he was the head of the church. And if you didn't go along with exactly what they were saying, you were going to be in trouble. And therefore, they were yoking, as Bradford said, the preachers with licenses to make sure that the state was going to make sure that every preacher was not preaching anything that would go against what the state believed, because every church was no longer separate from state authority. And so this was happening to the Pilgrims. They ended up forming their own church without permission of the king. John Robinson, their pastor, said, listen, the Bible says where two or three are gathered, there Christ is. We'd rather have Christ here than just some ceremony. And that was it. I mean, the King James then said he was going to harry them out of the land. So this was the kind of thing. And not only that, there was a law by 1585 that if a neighbor saw someone not attending the parish church and they were meeting in their homes, they were to turn them in. And if they didn't turn them in, they would get the same punishment that would come to the individuals worshiping outside the church. So you had that kind of pressure upon those people eventually called Pilgrims. Of course, they were not initially called Pilgrims.
So when they finally got to America, or to the New World, America, what was life like for them when they finally arrived?
Well, they decided when they left, they said there's got to be a good reason. Of course, they went to Holland for 11, 12 years, and Amsterdam and Holland, and had some freedom of religion there. And then when the wars were beginning to start with Spain, by 1620, they said, listen, this was their goal. Lastly, and which was not least, they said, a great hope we had, and an inward zeal to propagate and spread the gospel of the kingdom of Christ into the remote parts of the world, yea, though we would be stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work. So they knew that they were coming for a multi-generational vision. They knew they were coming not just for their own survival. Only 75 out of the 350 members of the Leiden congregation were sent out. And people forget the fact that New England, and in some sense America, is founded on a church plant. And here these individuals came, and they began to then came to the wilderness. And they came under a specific missionary charter. That missionary charter had been put together, and they were not to dominate. They were not to steal land. They were not to do those things. They were to serve the natives and bring the gospel and be a good example of Christian character. This was rare at the time period. The reputation of Christianity coming and dominating societies when, whether it was the Jesuits or anyone else, was rampant. And the Pilgrims wanted to come in a different spirit. And so when they did come, there were several key events that led to the what we call the first Thanksgiving. It was the first Thanksgiving for the Pilgrims, obviously not the first time anyone gave thanks for a harvest or the provisions of God. And the first key thing was the fact that they wanted to, in some way, make peace with the natives. And when that providentially took place in March of 1621, and they had this peace treaty with the Wampanoag and Massasoit. And Massasoit, and this was amazing because Massasoits, they had had a plague, their warriors had been depleted, they were getting threats by other tribes in the area, and so it was a dangerous situation even for the Wampanoag. But we believe, though it's not written directly in history, that when they saw the Pilgrims come with parents and children, wives and children, who never traveled at that time, they realized they were not coming to conquer. You don't bring your wives and children if you're going to just conquer the people and take it and steal it. Now, of course, there were all kinds of misunderstandings between the cultures. But that peace treaty in March of 1621, 2 weeks later, the Mayflower leaves. They are here to stay. Not one Pilgrim returned, even though they lost half their number in that first winter. They were devastated. And yet they began then to pray and to work with the natives. And providentially, one of the young boys who ran away into the woods got picked up by the Nauset tribe. Now, the Nauset tribe had been robbed of 22 of their natives in 1614 by an Englishman by the name of Hunt. And because of that, they were angry at the white man. And they fired their arrows at the Pilgrims the moment they saw them on the beach having their devotions, when they were still exploring and trying to find a place to settle. So now they had a hostage of theirs. And they communicated with Massasoit because now peace had been declared. And Massasoit said, listen, they know you took some corn. They know this. And the Pilgrims had discussed, if we take anything to help with our survival, we've got to pay them back. Providentially, in about August of 1621, they met with the Nauset tribe. And literally, they had a reconciliation service. And they apologized for their race for mistreating the natives and stealing those individuals, and that it was wrong. And after that, when they did that, the boy was returned totally well. They had merely held him, and they came to the plantation and they paid them to satisfy them for any corn they had taken. This is huge because without a peace treaty and without a reconciliation, there would have been no Thanksgiving. And think of how unique it is.
Amazing.
How unique it is in October of 1621. It's not the first time people gave thanks, but think of the ingredients. Right. You have 3-day feast. You have recreational athletics. We assume, and history says, probably wrestling matches, bow and arrow, musket contests, whatever it happens to be. But a 3-day feast with 90 natives, and only 45 to 50 Pilgrims are left alive. Only 4 adult women are there. Wow. The natives brought most of the food. And this is an amazing miracle.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating history that we have here. Our time's slipping away, though. I wanted to get this because I brought this up in the as we were leading into this, but there's been some Americans that have pointed to the Pilgrims as the first Americans to try out socialism. Break that down for us. How did that go for the Pilgrims?
Sure. Of course, the word socialism wasn't in vogue at the time, but what happened was that the financiers, in order for them to have this voyage, they had financiers, and some of them claimed to be Christians, and they felt that the Pilgrims were a good investment. They had lost a ton of money in trying to have plantations, whether it was Jamestown or any of the other ones, because they were not self-sustaining. And so they said, how could this be self-sustaining? Well, they said, look, they're coming as families. They're coming as a church in covenant with each other. This has got to be the best investment around. These people are not going to just leave their wives and children. So they invested in them. However, they wanted to insure themselves against a loss. Everybody wants to do that. But in this case, England had already devolved, we say, away from a free economy that they initially would have been spawned by Christianity. And they had what they called the common field concept, which meant everything was held in common. so that the individuals who were investing, and this is what they did, they changed their contract secretly on the Pilgrims when they were starting their voyage, going to England, and they made them work 6 days a week for the common good, the common store. And then people were paid somewhat equally out of that common store. But what they found out is Bradford says, look, we're starving here. After 1 year of trying this out, 2 years trying it out, by the time this happened, it was 1623. He said, look, they think that they're going to try a system of economy as if they're wiser than God, he wrote. No, we know this is not God's kind of economy. People were, women were saying, I don't want to wash other husbands' clothes. I don't want to be able to go into the field. And even if some people are sick, believe it or not, they said that even the best, Bradford says, even the best people with the greatest character and a hunger for God in the wilderness, they would still feign to be sick, knowing they were going to get food anyway. And it produced a laziness. Wow. It produced where the incentive was not there to work. So Bradford made a decision with them, without the permission of the financiers, that they would have to set corn and growing some small field. Now, they still kept the common field, but they broke away and said, look, each family's on their own. And if you don't work, you're not going to eat. Now, they didn't say that, but that's kind of the concept that was there. And this is the amazing fact. When they switched over in 1623, this is 2 years after that first harvest festival of Thanksgiving, which there's a lot of theories about where that originated. But the idea is in 1623, we had this happen. They tripled their production in 1 year of acreage and food when they went to this kind of free economy. That's a good lesson for people and Americans.
It sure is. It sure is. All right, real quickly, we only got a couple of minutes left here. Why did it take until President Lincoln's administration for Thanksgiving to become a national holiday? And what lessons can we as modern Americans learn from the Pilgrims and their first Thanksgiving?
Well, first of all, by the time Lincoln had done this, there was many, many Thanksgiving days. In fact, there were over 300 Thanksgiving days called in New England alone by the early 1800s. And most of the Thanksgivings were Thanksgiving. They had a prayer and fast day in the spring, and then a Thanksgiving service in the fall. Now, neither of those fit this first 1621 Thanksgiving, but the tradition of calling days of Thanksgiving was very prevalent. And it was particularly thanking God for the provisions he gave you, and even the difficulties he gave. Thanking God for the trials he put you through, because your character got refined as a result of it. Because the doctrine of Thanksgiving preached by the Pilgrims would be foreign to many Americans, and even Christians, because we don't tend to be, we're thankful when everything goes right, but we're not going to be thankful for when things go wrong. But this is what the doctrine they preached on this. And we had a Thanksgiving was called every year of the American Revolution. A Thanksgiving was called by George Washington when he became president, many presidents. So this was not new. The part of being a national holiday was what made it new. And when Jehle and all those individuals began writing the letters and whatnot to do that, that became a national holiday. And normally when it becomes a national something, it's because it was practiced at the local level. It's dangerous when you try to make something national when you've not been practicing it personally and locally. And in this case, Lincoln's was just the result of what had been practiced by churches and towns for decades and centuries.
Just a little over a minute to go. What kind of lessons do we need to learn as modern Americans from those first Pilgrims?
I think one of the first things we need to learn is to thank God in the midst of whatever we're going through. We tend to be very angry when things don't go our way, when election doesn't go our way, or some town ordinance goes in the wrong direction. But we need to thank God that through all of it, through the difficulty of honing our perseverance and moving forward and learning to serve and not thinking you can change a nation just politically. A nation has to be changed from the heart up. And asking God, help us, Lord, serve unconditionally, regardless of the results. I think that's the first lesson. I think a second lesson is we better be very thankful for the things that we do have and not constantly think about all the things that we don't have. And those two things would be key lessons. And a third lesson would be we have the story. People can go to our website, plymrock.org, plymrock.org. We have lots of resources on this. But the idea would be be thankful, and read the actual pilgrim story of Thanksgiving around the table and ask God to help us to be truly grateful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul Jehle. This is a fascinating story, and we appreciate so much you coming on. Hope you have a fantastic Thanksgiving, sir. Thank you for joining us.